This contrary bias is easily accounted for. It is a common observation that the mind has a great propensity to spread itself on external objects and to conjoin with them any internal impressions which they...
There it is again. External objects, internal impressions. Okay, so by all judgments of what he's saying here, he is a materialist. He's not an idealist, right? Or he's not something else than materialist, I should say, right? It's like there's materialism and then there's all sorts of other metaphysics, right? So he's talking about external objects. How does that fit with his metaphysics or his ontology maybe, right? Because he has impressions and ideas. And now he's talking about external objects. How does he get access to that? Because all he's referring to when he's sort of discussing cause and effect are impressions and ideas. And now they're objects all of a sudden, right? This is a crappy argumentation, right? He should be wiser than doing it this way, because then he should have presented his ideas of an external realm of some kind. External and internal, that is a dichotomy. Otherwise, if it's not a dichotomy, I don't know what the hell he's talking about, because if you say internal, then there's a third category called objects in his ontology, right? So if impressions and ideas is an ontology, then external must be something that is completely outside this dichotomy. Apparently, he says, spread itself on external objects and to conjoin them in internal impressions. So there's some relation between the inner objects and the external objects. Inner impressions and idea with external objects. This is the first time I think he's described so clearly that he's working from a materialist metaphysics. I cannot interpret this any other way, right? And it's kind of, it's a sign of, it's very natural to be a materialist as the first, because it's sort of an intuitive, self-inflicted idea that works in the everyday, right? So it has become so settled that one doesn't even discuss it or dispute it, or what's it called, criticize it, right? It's sort of it's something that is given from the starting point of my philosophy. So I'm not even going to. I have no urge to, right? But that is, if there is something that is problematic here, that will inflict itself on all of his philosophy, in my opinion, right? It might not be that everything is just corrupt and useless, but there will be certain aspects where this will stick out like a sore thumb, right? Okay, so if I haven't explained to you the inherent paradox in this kind of thinking, I might do a little explanation here, right? And it's quite simple, right? It's quite simple. I have my box. This is my box for my glasses that I use when I close reading, right? That if I'm saying this box, I have to start earlier. If I'm saying there is something outside my mind, then, and if I say that this one is outside my mind, right? Then what am I referring to? Because if my mind is somewhere in here, for instance, right? Enclosed in my skull, then, and I am saying this is outside my skull, then how do I get to it? Because if my mind is somewhere in here and my experience of it is in there, then what is this then, right? What am I referring to here? If it has colors and sounds and taste and so on, right? I tasted, right? Don't do this at home. Uh, then what am I referring to, right? This is an experience. This is not an object as such, right? So if you're saying it's an object that is external, how do I get to the external if I also have some picture in here, right? So this cannot be outside. That which I'm pointing to, that which I'm referring to, has to be an experience, because if I close my eyes, it disappears, right? Why would it disappear if I have access to it beyond my experiences? No, so I have to experience it, right? It doesn't go away from the outside because I close my eyes. I can't check it because I don't have experience as such. But the point is, it's the experience I'm referring to. And if it's an experience, it must be in here, right? But how can it be if I'm pointing to it out here, right? How does that work? Well, the only way it works is that all of this which I'm referring to is my experience. I am just pinpointing various aspects of that experience as if it is an outside. I am interpreting it as an outside. There is only the experience. There is no other thing. I'm not saying there isn't an outside. I'm saying that you do not have access to anything in the same manner as you have access to an experience. The experience is what you have access to. It's kind of logical, right? So if all this is an experience inside my mind, then, and I do not have access to an outside, then how do I get to an outside then, right? How do I get to an outside? Well, if I say, yeah, I'm gonna keep treating this as an outside, and then I realize it's paradoxical. Then I retract it to a so-called inside. But then I have just removed that which I thought was there because I didn't have access to it. Then I have to refute an outside also, right? I have to refute at least at this point, because all I have access to an experience that I used to interpret as an outside, right? So now I there's not even an inside anymore, because an inside demands there being an outside. And if I just rejected the outside, then there isn't even an inside. There's just experience, right? But the way my mind works, in order for this to work in the way that I'm usually using my mind and my experiences and my memories and so on, I have to treat it as if it's an outside, or at least some part of it is a representation of an outside. Then the only thing I can do, in my opinion, and this is one of the things I've criticized a guy like Bernardo Castro, somebody calling himself an analytic idealist, that I can only do it by stating an axiom that says, I am working from the idea that at least some part of my experience is a representation of an outside. That's the only way you can do it, in my opinion. There's no other way. Otherwise, you're going into, well, I'm used to doing it, so therefore it's there. That's a stupid argument, right? You can only, if you do not use an axiom where you just say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to work from this axiom so I can get further in my philosophy, right? You will have to come up with some bullshit in order to justify it, right? And I think people would rather come up with bullshit in that case, because an axiom seems like a weak argument. It's something that is particular to me. You are saying, when you're using an axiom, I am working from this idea. I'm not enforcing any philosophy on you, right? I'm saying I am working from it, right? That doesn't sound like you are presenting your philosophy and everybody, of course it follows that this, that, and the other, right? Just something like I don't know, I don't want to refer to that yet, right? That's also later in Hume, the in-thought gap, right? But I have accustomed myself to think this way, so I will find some kind of sophist argument for why I'm allowed to tell you that it follows, right? You can't do it. As soon as you reject the direct access to an outside, somehow based on your experiences, which is completely ridiculous, right? Then you have to reject the inside-outside dichotomy also, right? It would be something like saying, I mean, maybe this is a bad analogy, right? If you thought you had a car outside, right? But it was a dream or something like that. And then you go out and look, and there is no car. It was all, your fanciful thinking, right? And you go into your living room and sit there and say, okay, so I wonder how I will go to drive in that car. This is ridiculous, right? You just established that it isn't there. It was a dream, right? You were just used to treating that dream as if there was a car out there, right? And then you go back into your living room and start thinking about, okay, that car that is out there, right? That I just went out and said there is no car, right? It's something like that in order to pinpoint the ridiculousness of a materialist turned idealist, or at least a materialist discovering the paradoxical nature of a materialist metaphysics, rejecting metaphysics, has to, in the first step, reject an inside-outside dichotomy. And I will be very clear on that, because that's one of the problems of people rejecting materialism, is they keep the idea of that external world as if it's given to them. Of course it's there, but they just rejected any access to it of any kind, right? So, okay, I'm rambling a bit on this topic, but it is very, very, very fundamental, this, right? It doesn't get more fundamental. I mean, what could possibly be more fundamental in your understanding, right? So, to the best of my understanding here, there might be some language things and the understanding of the terms and so on. I will leave that possibility open, but in all normal sense of what he's saying here, it should be pretty straight up, right? On external objects and conjoin them with any internal impressions. So there are impressions inside and there are objects out there, right? Okay. Let's keep going.
They occasion, and which always make their appearance at the same time that these objects discover themselves to the senses.
So he is basically saying that there is some kind of, without understanding this, right? He is rejecting Descartes quite a lot, right? I think. I'm not sure, but it doesn't sound like he's a rationalist, right? That's in any standard. But he's saying that somehow the senses are, he states here, which they occasion, and which always makes their appearance at the same time that these objects discover themselves to the senses. Discover themselves? What is that? Is that an object that is outside that tell my senses, hey, I'm out here. Please make an impression inside that mind over there, so the mind has a one-to-one, whatever, something. I mean, how does this work? There's some completely unexplained cause and effect even here, right? That is almost sort of taken for granted, that he doesn't need to clarify, right? While he has spent, 100 pages or something trying to refute causes and effects among impressions. or is it among objects or what? Right? It starts to float now, right? So he doesn't have sufficient grip on this, in my opinion.
Thus, as certain sounds and smells are always found to attend certain visible objects, we naturally imagine a conjunction, even in place, betwixt the objects and qualities, though the qualities be of such a nature as to admit of no such conjunction, and really exist nowhere. But of this more fully hereafter, in Part 4, Section 5. Meanwhile, it is sufficient to observe that the same propensity is the reason why we suppose necessity and power to lie in the objects we consider, not in our mind that considers them, notwithstanding it is not possible for us to form the most distant idea of that quality, when it is not taken for the determination of the mind, to pass from the idea of an object to that of its usual attendant. But though this be the only reasonable account we can give of necessity, the contrary notion is so riveted in the mind from the principles above mentioned, that I doubt not but my sentiments will be treated by many as extravagant and ridiculous. What? The efficacy of causes lie in the determination of the mind? As if causes did not operate entirely independent of the mind, and would...
I like this. This is almost like he is. My English is not too good today. He's expecting somebody to say, what? The efficacy of causes lie in the determination of the mind? It's sort of, this is a quite modern way of writing philosophy, right? That's sort of it's very much an appeal to sort of a common, a common tongue, a common, somebody who's used to be among normal people, every day, butchers and bakers and, nurses and whatever, right? It's not somebody living in some ivory tower at the top of in the highest quarters in the tallest tower in Edinburgh Castle, right? Or Edinburgh University. It isn't, right? It's somebody who's used to talk to normal people, so to say, right? And I'm very, very sympathetic to his approach, right? Though there's a few things here or there so far that I have a strong sense that there's something that not is fully formed here, right? But okay, we are talking about the early 1700s, right? I'm just trying to imagine myself in the 1740s or late 30s, right? 1740 or 1739, and buying this book in a bookshop or in London, right? And this guy, David Hume, writing about these aspects of the mind, where his approach is not, I'm coming from my ivory tower of high flying, whatever, Newtonian, Cartesian, whatever, right? Rational, this follows from this follows from this follows from this. No, he's talking about, I don't find that when I research my mind. And referring to people as coming up with, a person might say, what? The efficacy of the causes lie in the determination of the mind? Sort of, this kind of approach is, I would think, quite modern, even for, 1800s, right? Let alone the 1700s and early 1700s, right? He's very, very modern, I would say. Some of this text sound dated with, modern, this kind of 21st century modernity, right? But back in the day, this must have been like, whoa, who's this dude, right?
Would not continue their operation, even though there was no mind existent to contemplate them or reason concerning them. Thought may well depend on causes for its operation, but not causes on thought. This is to reverse the order of nature and make that secondary which is really primary. To every operation, there is a power proportioned.
Yes, and by this, the order of nature and make that second which is primary. Yes, that's also a that's a good principle to avoid. That's why you want to have an ontology, right? You want to have an ontology because the ontology points out the order of nature, or in maybe better put, the order of how your mind works. And if you have established that order without screwing around with it in order to get where you want to get, then you are left with something that is a control mechanism for further discussions, for further philosophy. You can't just violate your ontology, right? And lo and behold, there aren't that many philosophers who want to make an ontology, right? Probably that's why people don't like Hume and his treatises and the conclusions of his ontology, right? It's a shackle around it's a chain around your leg that you have to constantly make sure that you don't violate, right? Mental chain around your thinking that no, you can't go there because you just settled that your ontology says you can't go there, so you can't go there, right? So and the more clear and more functional and more sort of handy manual like your ontology is, the better, because it's easier to bring it along to check up on further philosophy down the line, that you're not screwing around with your ontology. And if you don't have an ontology in your philosophy in the first place, well, then it's a shitty philosophy because it's just based on hearsay and wishful thinking, right?
And this power must be placed on the body that operates. If we remove the power from one cause, we must ascribe it to another. But to remove it from all causes and bestow it on a being that is no ways related to the cause or effect, but by perceiving them, is a gross absurdity and contrary to the most certain principles of human reason.
Personally, I would say that an ontology and the quality of your ontology is the degree to which you are a good philosopher. Because the idea of time is as applicable to how the mind works as applied to anything, right? It's not like a time is only an idea that is, as I've defined, maybe I'm contradicting myself a little here, but there's a sense of time that is a distance between memories, right? That's my definition. But that doesn't mean there can't be ideas of time somewhere else, right? Because the time is such a fundamental aspect of mind, I think, that even without thinking about it, mind uses time and a placement of the structured kind of thinking in order to make sure that you make the right decisions at the right time as best as possible, right? Or the time structure, the timed structure of your thinking, or how the mechanics of mind is a categorization of your various mental aspects. So you don't drag out aspects to rationalize about from the wrong shelf, so to say, right? You don't just base decisions on your life on, oh, I saw the color light blue, now I know what to do the rest of my life. That would be kind of crazy, right? So the colors are in a certain shelf out there, and then there's sort of a next level or next shelf of, sort of it's filtered down through the brain, so to say, in a structured manner. And when I sort of categorize my mind, I see this structure, right? I can't avoid it, sort of. And this is my mind, my awareness, attaching time understandings or structured aspects to my mind. If my thinking wants to do that, then why would I take any other approach? I'm sort of guided by my own mind to my thinking, right? I don't want to be careful not to invent shit about your mind because you are sort of academically or intellectually wedded to it, right? And you know, people can come up with seemingly all sorts of shit about how the mind works that is just based in seemingly, well, academic. I'm intellectual, sort of. I want it to be the case, kind of, right? So it's a an ontology is a description that your mind makes about your own mind, right? It's sort of a self-reflecting mind coming up with a story or an expression or a description. You can't step out of your mind and look from it from the outside. You are always inflicting the way the mind works on its own understanding, right? So you have to, at least to some extent, let the mind itself and not your intellect or the intellectual part of your thinking. This is sort of the old, you know, the lizard brain and the modern brain part is sort of fighting, you know, good and bad or whatever, you know, not good and bad, but you know, I see Gollum there. My precious, yes, go to no, you know, right? That you have to be careful not to bring things to the fray that isn't there, right? But still, you have to come up with some kind of ontology that describes how you think it works. So it has to be balanced. Maybe that's my point, right? You can't go all intellectual on it, but you can't either let the mind do it by its own accord, right? Because then it's not going to happen. So it has to be somewhat intellectual, you could say, but it's still without, you're constantly searching yourself and sort of thinking of, can I see that in my mind? Can I sort of, and that's what Hume is doing to the best of my understanding, and I like that, right? Okay, stop rambling.
I can only reply to all these arguments that the case is here much the same as if a blind man should pretend to find a great many absurdities in the supposition that the color of scarlet is not the same with the sound of a trumpet, nor light the same with solidity. If we have really no idea of a power or efficacy in any object, or of any real connection betwixt causes and effects, it will be to little purpose to prove that an efficacy is necessary in all operations. We do not understand our own meaning in talking so, but ignorantly confound ideas which are entirely distinct from each other. I am indeed ready to allow that there may be several qualities both in material and immaterial objects with which we are utterly unacquainted. And if we please to call these power or efficacy, it will be of little consequence to the world. But when, instead of meaning these unknown qualities, we make the terms of power and efficacy signify something of which we have a clear idea, and which is incompatible with those objects to which we apply it, obscurity and error begin then to take place, and we are led astray by a false philosophy. This is the case when we transfer the determination of the thought to external objects, and suppose any real intelligible connection betwixt them, that being a quality which can only belong to the mind that considers them. As to what may be said that the operations of nature are independent of our thought and reasoning, I allow it, and accordingly have observed that objects bear to each other the relations of contiguity and succession, that like objects may be observed in several instances to have like relations, and that all this is independent of and antecedent to the operations of the understanding. But if we go any farther and ascribe a power or necessary connection to these objects, this is what we can never observe in them, but must draw the idea of it from what we feel internally in contemplating them. And this I carry.
Yes, but he's very focused on the objects as such, and not that they are the dynamism of it, right? That they move about. It's not because there is an object if everything sort of, let's say, stood still, I wouldn't talk about cause and effect. I might be wondering about what made this come into existence. But maybe I wouldn't have any idea of existence if things didn't move around and change and disappeared out of view or whatever, right? And then I might say if everything stood still and I moved about, then I would wonder, then the most important question in philosophy would be, why are we moving, right? We always confounded about that which sticks out. That which is different from the rest, so to say, right? So he should be a little more concerned about how things move and why they move, rather than trying to look at the object and see, I've got to find some attribute about the object that makes it have a cause or an effect, right? And that's also one of the, Newton was partly at least responsible for the invention of calculus. So far as I understand, his way of doing it was inferior to how Leibniz did it, though likely Newton was first. And I don't know about this dispute, right? But, there is a dispute whether or not it was actually Newton or actually Leibniz, or they were sort of working together maybe, right? Secretly, which I don't think, of course, right? But, conspiracy. It's all about moving objects, right? It's the realization that things move, that they're dynamic. In a world where, you're starting to become industrialized and maybe not in the early 1700s, but still it was sort of on the cusp of the thinking of industrialization, right? Back in the day with horses, everything went slow, right? Everything went slow. The fastest was the fastest horse, right? So, unless you fell from the Eiffel Tower, right? Don't do this at home. That maybe because things are so slow, it's not that much on his mind, that it's about movement, right? So it seems like he's a little too focused on aspects of the object as such, whether or not they move, that they have something about them that makes them cause this and that and the other, right? So, but I don't want to get bogged into this discussion because I don't find it with what has run under the bridge the last 300 years, right? I would say that the discussion of cause and effect isn't that much of a big deal anymore as it might have been back then.
So far that I am ready to convert my present reasoning into an instance of it by a subtlety which it will not be difficult to comprehend. When any object is presented to us, it immediately conveys to the mind a lively idea of that object, which is usually found to attend it, and this determination of the mind forms the necessary connection of these objects. But when we change the point of view from the objects to the perceptions, in that case, the impression is to be considered as the cause and the lively idea as the effect. And their necessary connection is that new determination which we feel to pass from the idea of the one to that of the other. The uniting principle among our internal perceptions is as unintelligible as that among external objects, and is not known to us any other way than by experience. Now, the nature and effects of experience have been already sufficiently examined and explained. It never gives us any insight into the internal structure or operating principle of objects, but only accustoms the mind to pass from one to the other. It is now time to collect all the different parts of this reasoning, and by joining them together, form an exact definition of the relation of cause and effect, which makes the subject of the present inquiry. This order would not have been excusable of first examining our inference from the relation before we had explained the relation itself, had it been possible to proceed in a different method. But as the nature of the relation depends so much on that of the inference, we have been obliged to advance in this seemingly preposterous manner and make use of terms before we were able exactly to define them or fix their meaning. We shall now correct this fault by giving a precise definition of cause and effect. There may two definitions be given of this relation, which are only different by their presenting a different view of the same object and making us consider it either as a philosophical or as a natural relation, either as a comparison of two ideas or as an association betwixt them. We may define a cause to be an object precedent and contiguous to another, and where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations of precedency and contiguity to those objects that resemble the latter. If this definition be esteemed defective because drawn from objects foreign to the cause, we may substitute this other definition in its place. That is, a cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. Should this definition also be rejected for the same reason, I know no other remedy than that the persons who express this delicacy should substitute a juster definition in its place. But for my part, I must own my incapacity for such an undertaking. When I examine with the utmost accuracy those objects which are commonly denominated causes and effects, I find in considering a single instance that the one object is precedent and contiguous to the other, and in enlarging my view to consider several instances, I find only that like objects are constantly placed in like relations of succession and contiguity. Again, when I consider the influence of this constant conjunction, I perceive that such a relation can never be an object of reasoning, and can never operate upon the mind, but by means of custom, which determines the imagination to make a transition from the idea of one object to that of its usual attendant, and from the impression of one to a more lively idea of the other. However extraordinary these sentiments may appear, I think it fruitless to trouble myself with any farther inquiry or reasoning upon this subject,
Finally.
but shall repose myself on them as on established maxims.
Okay, so let me go back a bit and check out these definitions. It's sign of, in any case, in my opinion, it's a sign of some weakness that you need to give two definitions of the same aspect. If you need two different definitions, there's something in either definition that isn't fully formed. That's just a sort of a basic axiom I'm working from, right? If you can't define it in one definition, there's something wrong. There's something missing. There's a weakness somewhere, right? Okay. So if two definitions is better than one, why not 5,000 definitions to make sure that all possible avenues are covered, right? That, is sort of this slippery slope thing, right? One definition always. Okay. He's defining cause here. So he's not defining effect. We'll keep that clear, right? Okay, the first one is an object precedent and contiguous to another. I might have to look up the term contiguous. Don't remember exactly what the definition is. It's sort of it is next to it, right next to it, so to say, or what, or touching, or yes. Contiguous, this is the Merriam-Webster, being in actual contact, touching along a boundary or a point. Then there's another one, near, next or near in time or sequence. Touching or connected throughout in an unbroken sequence. So it's right next to and touching, then when it's contiguous. Okay. There's an object here, then there's a precedent object that is touching it. Okay. And where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations of precedency and contiguity to those objects that resemble the latter. I'll have to take this one again. An object preceding and contiguous to another, and where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations. Okay, he's defining what the cause is. The cause is the object he's describing. It has to be placed like this. And all for anything to be cause, it has to have a like resembling former placed in like relation of precedency and contiguity. It has to be preceding and it has to be contiguous, meaning it has to be in actual contact with the actual next object. In other words, a cause is an object preceding and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. I have to take this again. A cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other. So you have an idea of it, then you form a new idea of the next one before it's the case. I'm not sure. He wants to stick to, I have these ideas and I have to place my definition within these ideas because that's the things I'm working with. I'm not particularly fond of these. I'm not saying there's something incorrect about them, but they don't help me understand the necessity. It doesn't help me understand how to use it for anything, right? It doesn't help me get further down the line in my philosophy. And so why are we doing this thing here, right? This is sort of an early Enlightenment thing. It's just it's very cumbersome. This, right? It's extremely cumbersome, and I don't blame early 1700s people for not jumping all over Hume for his book, right? This first book, and which this is sort of, now we are getting to the end of the first book, is sort of okay. I don't think I might be buying the next book, right? And if you're a Christian, which a lot of people were back then, you would sort of say, okay, he's just trying to find some weirdo philosophical mind bending whatever idea of how to refute religion, right? So I think, if anything, these chapters on cause and effect, with an underlying agenda of refuting Christianity, to the best of my understanding, might be where he shoot his own foot, right? Okay, and that's why it was falling stillborn from the press, right? And he got to publish 3 books, right? The second book and the third book, and that's why these chapters and so on, they are split up in books and parts and sections, right? Okay, so let me get back to where we were.
It will only be proper, before we leave this subject, to draw some corollaries from it, by which we may remove several prejudices and popular errors that have very much prevailed in philosophy. First, we may learn from the foregoing doctrine that all causes are of the same kind, and that in particular there is no foundation for that distinction which we sometimes make betwixt efficient causes and cause.
Now that's a bit of a stretch, maybe, right? But how can he say that they are of the same kind? If he says that is something the mind makes up, then the mind might as well make up 3 or 4 different kinds of causes and effects, right? Exactly because it isn't an impression. It's something that the mind adds, right? So the mind is trying to second guess something that it can't experience, you could say, right? So why would it second guess and third guess and fourth guess and fifth guess, right? I mean, he has just created 2 different definitions of that, a thing that is only one thing, right? So it's quite confused, this, in my opinion.
Sine qua non, or betwixt efficient causes and formal and material and exemplary and final causes. For as our idea of efficiency is derived from the constant conjunction of 2 objects, wherever this is observed, the cause is efficient, and where it is not, there can never be a cause of any kind. For the same reason, we must reject the distinction betwixt cause and occasion, when supposed to signify anything essentially different from each other. If constant conjunction be implied in what we call occasion, it is a real cause. If not, it is no relation at all, and cannot give rise to any argument or reasoning. Secondly, the same course of reasoning will make us conclude that there is but one kind of necessity, as there is but one kind of cause, and that the common distinction betwixt moral and physical necessity is without any foundation in nature. This clearly appears from the precedent explication of necessity. It is the constant conjunction of objects, along with the determination of the mind, which constitutes a physical necessity. And the removal of these is the same thing with chance. As objects must either be conjoined or not, and as the mind must either be determined or not to pass from one object to another, it is impossible to admit of any medium betwixt chance and an absolute necessity. In weakening this conjunction and determination, you do not change the nature of the necessity, since even in the operation of bodies, these have different degrees of constancy and force without producing a different species of that relation. The distinction which we often make.
If Hume was such a smartass, right, and he is very Newtonian, he should point out that there's a problem in Newton, which was why, Einstein became Einstein, right? That there seems to be an instant cause and effect between objects in the universe. In the understanding that according to Newton, there is an invisible force that works over distances, that holds planets in place. Obviously, they are, to the best of any understanding, even back then, Galileo and his telescopes and so on, they are so far removed from each other. They are not contiguous, right? And yet they can insert a force on each other. How does that work, Mr. Hume, right? Mr. Newtonian skeptic, right? So, yeah.
Betwixt power and the exercise of it is equally without foundation. Thirdly, we may now be able fully to overcome all that repugnance which it is so natural for us to entertain against the foregoing reasoning, by which we endeavored to prove that the necessity of a cause to every beginning of existence is not founded on any arguments either demonstrative or intuitive. Such an opinion will not appear strange after the foregoing definitions. If we define a cause to be an object precedent and contiguous to another, and where all the objects resembling the former are placed in a like relation of priority.
It's also this. There's something lacking in the Newtonian problem of forces acting on a distance in the universe, and at the same time Hume trying to argue for contiguous precedent objects being causes of another. Then if there's distance between objects like the moon and earth, how do they cause each other's effect, or how does that work, right? That seems to be completely he's completely oblivious to that, right? And there's also this, that Einstein came up with the idea that space is a player in this, right? That which the objects, so to say, are swimming around in is actually that which creates the effect. All right? That is the cause. The effect is that you see them moving around in a particular fashion, right? So it's the interaction between space and objects, so to say, matter and space or whatever, right? That's the present explanation, which is more efficient and with fewer holes. The Newtonian problem of forces, causes acting on a distance, has been demolished then, right? That is a problem that Hume should have pointed out, and he, being a Newtonian in the sense of the subtext of the title or the subtitle of the book, he should be aware of this and point it out, right? And how that works with his philosophy.
And contiguity to those objects that resemble the latter, we may easily conceive that there is no absolute nor metaphysical necessity that every beginning of existence should be attended with such an object. If we define a cause to be an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it in the imagination that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other, we shall make still less difficulty of assenting to this opinion.
Isn't this a third definition? An object presented and contiguous to another, and so united. And so united that the idea of the one determines the mind to form. No, it's the second one. The idea of the other and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. Yes, it's the second one. Okay, so we were still only at 2.
Such an influence on the mind is in itself perfectly extraordinary and incomprehensible, nor can we be certain of its reality but from experience and observation. I shall add as a fourth corollary that we can never have reason to believe that any object exists of which we cannot form an idea. For as all our reasonings concerning existence are derived from causation, and as all our reasonings concerning causation are derived from the experienced conjunction of objects, not from any reasoning or reflection, the same experience must give us a notion of these objects and must remove all mystery from our conclusions. This is so evident that it would scarce have merited our attention were it not to obviate certain objections of this kind which might arise against the following reasonings concerning matter and substance. I need not observe that a full knowledge of the object is not requisite, but only of those qualities of it which we believe to exist. End of file 29.
So, that was the end of section 14, and section 15 will be rules by which to judge of causes and effects. So we are not done with the topic yet. So this is something that is really, 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 really very much on Hume's mind, right? And it has its shortcomings, as I pointed out, though, still keep in mind that this is sort of 300 years old, and he's coming from a point where he doesn't have nearly the amount of further insights into the field that we possibly have now, right? Or better understandings or better models and so on, right? So he's arguing from a particular scientific view. And it's dogmatic in that sense that it's built into his thinking without him realizing that or without stating that he's working from these built-in kind of axioms, right? So beware of that. And that's also why it's, at this point in time, this causation discussion isn't really that interesting. At least not to me. It might be to you, and God bless you for that. Or, I don't want to sound religious, but, knock yourself out, was what I would rather say, right? And then I'll say, well, before this passes by the 1 hour mark, I'll say, please share, like, and subscribe. Give me a comment. Let me know what you think. This is the 26th or 27th or something like that, part of this deconstruction. Are you following along? I seem to have got a couple of new, 4 or 5 new subs, and thank you for stopping by. I am happy that I can service you in this matter. Please join the board and let's keep the discussion going. Or board, it's the Discord forum, link below. And consider a donation. I like to have a bottle of red wine now and then, and to celebrate my philosophy, so to say. Sitting here saying, hey, I'm great because people are, giving me money. Now, I cannot, if I was judging from the money I get, I should be one of the worst philosophers, right? And I'll just classify myself as being one of those who are great, but people don't want to accept it, right? No, I'm not a megalomaniac, right? So, but in any case, have a nice day. See you in the next one.